Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Annie Larkin, the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Amerind Museum. And welcome to our talk, The Global Spanish Empire, Colonial and Indigenous Placemaking and Pluralism Across Time and Space, with John G. Douglas and Christine Beaule. Thank you to our members and donors who not only make this type of programming possible, but Amerind's mission to promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn more about how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission, you can become a member or donor by visiting amerind.org. On August 22nd, we will have a free online flute and storytelling performance with Randy Kemp. Please visit Amerind's website at amerind.org or the events section on Amerind's Facebook page for registration details. Then on September 5th, we will host the free online lecture, Conquerors of the Land and Sea, the Peopling of the Fuego Patagonia with Marta Alfonso Durruti. Please visit, again, our amerind.org website or the events section of our Facebook page for registration details. And also a reminder that the Amerind Museum has reopened to the public. We are open Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And Amerind is implementing increased safety precautions as we welcome guests back to the museum. And to learn more about that, visit amerind.org. All right. So Dr. Christine Beaule is an associate professor in the Department of Languages and Literatures of Europe and the Americas at the University of Hawaii, Mānoa. Her work focuses on Spanish colonialism in both the Philippines and the Central Highland Andes. And Dr. John Douglas is Vice President of Research and Standards at Statistical Research, Inc., and adjunct professor in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. His research is focused on Indigenous colonial interaction, religious performance, household archaeology, and community creation in the American Southwest, California, and Mesoamerica. And Amerind is thankful to both Christine and John for sharing their time and knowledge and allowing us to connect with our audience today. So thank you both and welcome.
Thank you so much, Annie. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and aloha mai kako to the audience wherever you are. We are grateful that you are interested in, here we go. Can you see the slideshow or is it PowerPoint?
It is currently the PowerPoint.
Yeah, you go into slideshow mode.
There we go. Now, my screen is showing both, so. Yes?
There we go.
Okay, excellent. Okay. So in 2018, John and I, who had gone to graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh together many years ago at this point, we organized an electronic symposium at the annual Society for American Archaeology meetings. We recruited the authors for 16 papers. An electronic symposium is different than a regular conference symposium because all of the full papers are posted a month before the meetings on the website, and then the audience and panelists have a chance to download and read all of them, and our time together at the conference was devoted to discussion. It was an incredibly engaging and lively discussion with a lot of fairly surprising points of connection between this international group of scholars, and the audience was highly engaged in the discussion as well.
So at the end of the SAA meeting, Christine and I were notified that our session had won the SAA Amerind Award. And so we were invited to go to the Amerind Foundation that fall and spend 5 days doing a workshop working on a preparation for a book. And we were just thrilled to be invited. We were treated so well, and we just so enjoyed engaging with each other, both in person and in 3 cases, 3 senior authors weren't able to actually come, but we were able to work remotely with each other and critique each other's papers and offer feedback. And just to give you a broad idea of the participants, among the contributing authors, both senior and other, we had 6 international universities included, 12 US universities, and 3 consulting firms as well. So it was a really nice mixture of folks coming from different backgrounds. And given that the topic was an international topic, we felt it was really important to make sure that we had a broad spectrum of participants from across the world. So placemaking. You know, when we talk about, there's two different elements to the book that we wanted to focus on today, both placemaking and pluralism. And I just want to read a quote from Jerry Moore. He says, "Space is indifferent to humanity, but place requires the inscription of human acknowledgement." And so really what he's talking about here is there's a difference between space and place. Space can be ubiquitous. In front of you, the landscape, the larger landscape, a wide variety of different things. But creating places means something related to specific meaning or social meaning. It's representing social relationships, experiences, and memories. And it could be both an individual or a group. And when we're talking about colonial settings, one of the important things to consider is this plurality of engagement. And so you may have a broad spectrum of ideas about a particular place, not just one. And they're also going to be very fluid. You know, Lee Panitch talks about in colonial settings, identity, like we think places, are in a constant process of becoming. And so I think that that's really relevant to the topic today. When we talk about this book, we're talking about almost 500 years of Spanish colonialism across the world in different places, and things weren't static. And so both colonists and indigenous people across the world from time to time and place to place are going to have different meaning for different places.
It's important too to realize that pluralism is inherent to the colonial experience. So from the beginning of its colonial enterprise, particularly in the Americas, Spain attempted to set up 2 categories, right, of identity. One was the Spanish, right, and one was this really broad category, Indios, right, or Indians, which was supposed to subsume all indigenous peoples. But from the very beginning, right, there were African slaves, right, as well as freed Africans. There were indigenous peoples from different groups who they had encountered along the way. There were indigenous allies, right, who were instrumental in those wars of conquest, both in Mexico and Peru. And individuals from each of these groups traveled with the Spanish. And so colonial settings are incredibly culturally pluralistic, right? However, given the formal structure of Spanish and Indian, right, what that means is that individuals from each group that participates in these exploratory voyages and the construction and maintenance of colonies, et cetera, really struggles to find their place within it. Their relationships, the progeny of their interethnic marriages, et cetera, also further complicate, right, the pluralistic nature of these colonies. Often what will happen is that different cultural groups within a colony will seek to create boundaries, right? So this could be geographic boundaries like barrios or neighborhoods such as Chinatown in Honolulu, right? Or it can be the creation of new boundaries, right? Defined by ethnicity, by religion, by place of origin, et cetera. And so colonial settings, right, by their very nature, create these very complex social and political relationships between different groups and individuals. So pluralism, along with placemaking, emerged as central themes, right, thanks to our Amerind workshop.
So today I just wanted to give you one very brief example of placemaking, maybe to help, give a concrete example. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research myself and my colleagues have done in Southern California and what's now West Los Angeles, and a native village called Guaspet, which was a Gabrielino or Tongva village, just north of LAX and just south of Santa Monica in an area known today as the Ballona wetlands. And native Californians had lived in this location for approximately 7,000 years. They had a number of different villages, including one that we know from the ethnohistoric literature from the colonial period called Guaspet, which was located tucked in between the wetlands, the Ballona wetlands, and the slopes leading to the bluff slopes leading to the uplands. So it would have been a very rich location in terms of habitation, and people were hunters and gatherers. They went in a seasonal round from year to year, but likely every single year they came back to this location. Next slide. And so for 7,000 years, people lived here doing what they did. And then the Spanish showed up in California in 1769. They actually left just south of Tucson, where I live, from Tubac on an overland expedition to San Diego and further north. And soon after established Mission San Gabriel, the Pueblo of Los Angeles, and soon afterwards, a large number of ranchos in the LA basin. And this really, really affected the ability of native Californians to continue doing their everyday traditional life and lifeways. And as a result, they started to emerge doing different activities, getting involved with the rancho economy, being recruited to the missions, and so forth. Next slide. And so as a result of the colonial period, very quickly, Guaspet and native life, as people knew it in California, changed dramatically. And as a result, the village of Guaspet changed as well. Within a generation of the Spanish showing up, the village of Guaspet was essentially not being used as a habitation location as it had for 7,000 years, and started being used as something different, as a place for the ancestors, a place to bury people that had died during the mission period and before that. And this was a very special place. It had, we're sure, a lot of connection to social memory, given its 7,000-year history. And we're quite sure that people were coming from quite some distance to be buried at Guaspet. And so it was a palimpsest. It was a very important place on the social landscape and a very important place for Gabrielino people. And it really changed, through time from a space to a place. Next slide. And so during the colonial period, as I mentioned, within a generation of the Spanish showing up, the village of Guaspet was no longer being used, and it was no longer being used by roughly 1815 as a burial area, as far as we know. But we start to see around the same time on Spanish colonial maps, things like Guaspita or Corral de Guaspita on the bluffs right above the location of the former village of Guaspet. And so the Spanish were doing placemaking as well. They were creating places on the landscape and taking the names that had been used before by native peoples, but transforming them much in the way that they transformed the landscape from one of wild and native terrain to a very managed landscape, utilitarian landscape for sheep and cattle and horses. And so, so this is just one example of placemaking that we thought would be helpful to folks to get their head around a little bit more.
So this map is taken from our introductory chapter to the book. We chose to use a world map and then marked the location of each of the chapters, each of the case studies included in the book. You can see it's truly global. The other thing that's notable to note that makes this edited volume different from most case studies of Spanish colonialism is that we didn't just focus on the Americas, right? As that was certainly the heartland of Spanish colonialism and what we popularly think of, right, when we think of Spanish colonialism, particularly Latin America. But we also have a case study from Krista Korse in West Africa. We've got a case study from the Philippines where the Spanish had a presence for about 350 years. We have one from Guam, right, where there's an ephemeral but important Spanish mission there, as well as the Solomon Islands, right? And then within the Americas, we also chose to look at outside the heartland or the capitals of Spanish colonialism. And so this case study number 6 is actually from a fairly rural area in the Peruvian highlands. We've got one from northern Colombia, and then 2 case studies in Oaxaca and in Central America. And then finally the Caribbean and the Southeast and South Texas. So the global scale of Spanish colonialism really set the stage for us to be able to see the full range of interactions and colonial experiences. And this global perspective, right, allowed us to bring very different regional literatures into dialogue with each other. So what I mean by that is John and I don't have time to even keep up with the literature that's published in our own areas, let alone to go exploring, right, what people working in the Philippines or the Pacific, for example, have to say about colonial interactions and colonial experiences. And so this kind of an Amerind workshop really brought together scholars who wouldn't normally get the chance to learn about each other's work. We also span, as John said, about 500 years of history and historical archaeology from the 1400s through the 1800s. So the entire range of the Spanish colonial enterprise is touched on in the book. And there are a couple of important lessons that came out of this. One, as I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, is that this experience really helped us to problematize identity categories, right? And break down these common and popular ways of talking about people in cases of European colonialism as being indigenous or Spanish, right? In fact, it's a much more complex social landscape. And it also brought into view the full range of interactions, right? So there are case studies included in the book, particularly from the Pacific, that are essentially failures, right? Where places where the Spanish attempted unsuccessfully, right, to create colonies, all the way to a full colonial settlement.
So the book is kind of organized more or less chronologically, and our talk today jumps around a little bit, but the themes actually are kind of chronological as well. And so the first 2 chapters by both Krista Korse, looking at West Africa, Portuguese West Africa, and Corinne Hoffman and her colleagues from the University of Leiden are looking at 2 of the anchor points really for European colonialism. Chris, of course, is actually looking at the Portuguese, and normally when we talk about the Spanish, we're talking really about the Iberian Peninsula as well. And Chris's work in all across West Africa, really, from Ivory Coast to Ghana to Nigeria, he's really interested in looking at the very early periods. So his chapter is looking at a place in Ghana called Fort Elmina, which was founded in the 1400s. And it's a very interesting case study. Many times when we talk about Spanish colonialism, they were focused on three things. They were focused on mineral extraction and wealth. They were focused on labor, and they were focused on saving souls, on evangelicalizing. And in Chris's case, he argues that when the Portuguese showed up in West Africa in the 1400s at Elmina, they were much more interested in the economic side of things. And they were privateers in a sense. So it wasn't this crown, process. So Elmina was the first sub-Saharan Africa European colony. And one of the interesting things that Chris notes is that for the very early period, about 150 years until the Dutch took over Elmina, archaeologically, it's very hard to identify. Only later was the fort, the castle that you may know about, was established really during the Dutch period. And so from a very early time, there really wasn't that strong of a presence beyond trade. You don't tend to see a lot of European artifacts at Elmina from these early periods. He argues that there really wasn't a lot of identity change beyond among locals, beyond starting to identify themselves more with Elmina than with some of the local ethnic groups in the area. But one of the things that Chris does argue is that the introduction of different food groups from these early periods in West Africa were possibly some of the most notable things that you see that have transcended time. Things like the introduction of corn, sweet potato, pineapple, coming from both the Americas and Asia from these early Portuguese trade endeavors, had a much stronger impact than some other aspects of colonialism in West Africa. And the second case study by Corrine Hoffman and her colleagues at University of Leiden in the Netherlands, they're focused on the Caribbean. And Columbus, on his first voyage to the Americas in 1492, set foot partially in Cuba, and soon afterwards the island of Hispaniola, where Dominican Republic is today, from a very early stage, got settled, started settling towns, and started doing a number of different voyages across the Caribbean and into the Americas, looking for things including mineral wealth, labor. Corrine talks about up to 500,000 Amerindians were enslaved in the Caribbean by the Spanish, and also saving souls from the Spanish point of view. But in both cases, for both Chris and Corrine, I think one of the important things to remember is that they talk about perseverance quite a bit in their chapters as well. The perseverance of traditions, the perseverance of traditional technologies, a wide variety of things. And so I think that we need to remember that when we think about these early stages of colonialism. Clearly there were a lot of deleterious effects, a lot of negative sides, but at the same time, cultures continue to persevere.
It's also important to remember that everywhere that the Spanish went, we already had, right, a very multi-ethnic, pluralistic landscape, right, social landscape. So in chapter 3, Chris Rodning and his colleagues are looking at the impacts of early exploratory Spanish expeditions throughout what is today the US Southeast. This map from the chapter gives you some sense, right? It's incomplete, but nonetheless, it gives you some sense of the cultural pluralism that existed at that time. And so the impacts of interactions, however brief, with the Spanish, as well as the material goods that they left behind, which were incorporated in a variety of ways into local indigenous ritual traditions, trading networks, etc., really showed that the Spanish didn't show up into a homogeneous landscape of Indios, right? But rather a highly dynamic, multi-ethnic landscape that was already being impacted, it's important to note, by the epidemic diseases that preceded them from the Spanish. In chapter 4, similarly, Stacy King's long-term study of the colonial Sierra Sur in Oaxaca, Mexico, was similarly a multi-ethnic landscape with a very deep and complex history of interactions, of political alliances, of wars of conquest, of trade, right, of social networks, etc. And so the landscape, right, in both of these cases and in most of the cases of the book were highly complex, right, and continued to be so throughout the colonial period.
So this next chapter is by Laura Matthew and Bill Fowler. And they both, Laura, it's a great chapter. Laura is an ethnohistorian and an historian, and Bill is both an historical period archaeologist and a straight up archaeologist. Bill has been working at a number of these colonial sites, including Ciudad Vieja in El Salvador, since the 80s. And so they got together for this book to really combine both archaeological data as well as the ethnohistoric literature. Laura has a long history of working in Guatemala and El Salvador. And you know, one of the really interesting things about their chapter is they're talking about the two earliest towns in Central America. In El Salvador, it's in San Salvador, and in Guatemala. And in both these cases, the Spanish showed up and established a grid that is sometimes called a traza in Spanish. And this kind of grid hails from southern France and northern Spain, well back in the Middle Ages, and was used in Hispaniola soon after Columbus showed up, and was used all over Mexico as well, and was used in other places around the world by the Spanish. And it gave them a sense of structure, and also was a defensive mechanism in terms of the architectural grid of it around a plaza and so forth. But one of the things that Laura and Bill talk a lot about in their chapter is what they call a tent coexistence. When the Spanish, when Pedro Alvarado went to Guatemala in his first of two campaigns in 1524, only 5 years after Cortez showed up in Mexico, there were only a few hundred Spanish and 8,000 to 10,000 Central Mexicans, Nahua people, who came along as allies to help conquer El Salvador and Guatemala. And there actually were two different campaigns in 1524 and later in the 1520s. And once these towns really started to get established by the late 1520s, it really was a tense coexistence. You had people that were Spanish or so-called Spanish. You had a large number of Central Mexicans. You had enslaved Africans, you had freed Africans, and you had a wide variety of different ethnic groups of Maya. You know, when we talk about the Maya, we're not talking about some homogeneous group. There's almost 30 different language groups of Maya. And in the highlands where there's a large number. And so you really tended to see their depiction in this chapter is talking about these two towns and how, at the one hand, these are very European towns in terms of structure, but when you look at it both from the ethnohistoric literature as well as archaeologically, you get a very different sense of it being quite possibly a much more indigenous sort of place. You hardly have any imported European artifacts. You do tend to find some locally made copies of, say, for example, Italian ceramics. In a lot of different contexts, archaeological contexts in both these towns, you find all sorts of traditional technologies, including the use of obsidian, you know, a wide variety of different sorts of things. And the ethnohistoric documents talk a lot about the markets, about daily interactions between people, and how in many cases there was such a tension that the Central Mexicans were able to, in some cases, take advantage of that over the Spanish. And in some cases, local indigenous Maya were able to get advantage over the Spanish. As one example of many, they talk about how for many years, the Spanish had demanded that the local Maya in Guatemala set up their own town nearby. They didn't want to do that. And when the Maya finally came to them after several years and said, yes, we'd like to set up a village, but we'd like to do it on the land currently occupied by the Central Mexicans. So, you know, there's just all sorts of neat examples in their chapter talking about not only at a very high level, but at a very intimate level about these changes in identity and the reality of living on the edge of the Spanish territory during this time.
And so again, the plurality of indigenous groups is something that the Spanish may have glossed over in their version of the history of Spanish colonialism, but it's something that becomes very apparent once you start looking at these different case studies. In the case of the two Pacific case studies that were included in the book, they really add a lot of value. When the campaigns to conquer Central America and Peru were going on very, very quickly, there were different explorers like Álvaro de Mendaña in 1567 who led 2 vessels and 160 men leaving Peru on exploratory voyages in the Pacific, right? They were still after those trade routes, right, to the Far East, particularly to China, right, that had motivated Christopher Columbus a generation before. This map on the left is the first map that was drawn of the Pacific by a European explorer. It dates to 1589. You can see that their sense of the world and what is and isn't there was highly limited at the time. On these ships, these 160 men, it's also important to realize that it included freed and enslaved Africans. It included Central Mexicans, right? It included who we would now refer to as Quechua in Peru, right? A different indigenous group. And they picked up along the way a variety of indigenous peoples from different Pacific islands as well. When they landed, right, the 4 Franciscan friars, particularly who accompanied Mendaña on his second exploratory voyage, had a ritual of possession that they would enact on the beach, right? So this painting on the right is actually an imagined picture of Christopher Columbus, right, landing for the first time in the Caribbean, but the ritual, right, of possession on the beach is an ephemeral one that would leave no archaeological evidence. We know from the historical record that it usually included erecting a wooden cross, right, and having the friars lead a variety of group prayers, right? And then a simple declaration that these explorers were claiming the lands, right? All of the lands that they could see on behalf of the emperors, right? Who had sent them and financed their voyages. Of course, the reality, right, is very, very different. So many times when these European explorers and their multi-ethnic crews would attempt then to enact possession, right, evangelization, trade relationships, etc., they were told, right, they didn't have the personnel and they certainly didn't have the local knowledge. They were vastly outnumbered, etc. And so in chapter 7, we actually had to talk Martin Gibbs from Australia into being part of the volume, because he said, well, where I work in the Solomon Islands, the Spanish failed, right? There was no colonial presence. And we said, that's perfect, right? Because we don't usually, again, include failures, right, in stories of colonial enterprises. But in fact, this kind of failed, right, attempt to colonize a place was an important part of the colonial enterprise. For example, when the Spanish made it to the Philippines, right, the Philippines is composed of over 7,000 islands. They enacted a similar ritual of possession, right? This is a form of placemaking, right? This is now a Spanish place, right? You are now Spanish subjects. You will soon be Catholic subjects, etc. And here in the Philippines, they were successfully able to establish a stronghold, and they claimed colonial possession over the Philippines for about 350 years until the US took the Philippines from Spain. The reality on the ground, however, is extremely different, right? So other than a fort called Intramuros in what is today Manila, and a variety of Spanish cathedrals, right, along the western coast of the main island of Luzon, there's very little Spanish presence there, right? It's hard to say, and it's hard to find, right, any evidence of the Spanish. So one thing that the Spanish did was to try to recreate, right, their so-called successes in the Americas. They had a fleet of priests, right, a variety of Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits who were sent out to evangelize. And one of the strategies that they brought with them from their conquest of the Americas was reducciones, right? So these reductions were Spanish towns, right? And the indigenous people who live nearby were supposed to move, right, to these Spanish towns where they could be better supervised in terms of conversion to Catholicism, and most importantly, where their labor, right, could be used as well. But the indigenous Filipinos from different barangays, right, or kinship-based communities in and around these reducciones would simply move away, right? And so there was no way to enforce the dictate that they remain there, that they convert, etc. So at its absolute height, right, at its peak, the Spanish colonial presence in the Philippines, right, again, more than 7,000 islands, numbered about 300 individuals at its peak. It got to the point, because they never found the vast mineral wealth or the ancient civilizations, right, that meant population density and a lot of labor that they could exploit in one place. It got to the point where Europeans in Mexico, right, had no intention, right, of going westward, and so the Spanish implemented a system where they brought troublemakers, right, and criminals or prisoners, which were often like third and fourth sons who weren't interested in a trade. They would send them on these ships forcibly to the Philippines. So there are some European goods in these Spanish settlements. Here is an example from Grace Barreto Tesoro, who looks at one of these reducciones, one of these towns of indigenous Tagalogs in San Juan, Batangas. Also, there were these rice terraces that have been excavated in a long-term project by Stephen Acabado of UCLA. The rice terraces are particularly interesting because here we see placemaking in action today, right? So for a long time, this is a World Heritage Site. If you Google Filipino rice terraces, you'll see these gorgeous landscapes, right? That attract a lot of tourists, and that more importantly are a real source of indigenous pride for Filipinos. It has long been assumed that these rice terraces are about 2,000 years old, right? In fact, Stephen's archaeological research there has shown that they date to the Spanish colonial period for the most part. And the reason why that's interesting is because they are not an imposition on the landscape by the Spanish, right? There were not Jesuits, for example, who showed up and said, okay, you will terrace all of these hillsides. These hillsides were terraced, right, by indigenous Ifugao in northern Luzon in response to the economic opportunity offered by Spanish colonialism, right? And so because indigenous Filipinos labor was not well controlled, right, by the Spanish in and around Manila, the Spanish really came to depend on the Chinese, right, who were not even supposed to be there. So at this time in the 16th and 17th century, the Chinese empire, right, refused to allow anyone official permission to leave China, right? And so what that meant was the Chinese who left China and who went to stay in the Philippines, whether temporarily or on a more permanent basis, were technically illegal immigrants, right? And so the Spanish really came to depend on them. They were highly vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. There were periodic massacres of the Chinese in and around Manila. They were the primary workers for construction, in religious art, right, studios. And so a lot of the religious art, the statues, the paintings, et cetera, that came out of the colonial religious enterprise in and around Manila really have Chinese features and Chinese characteristics. So again, back to the rice terraces, this was an indigenous, right, accomplishment, but it was one that was controlled for and by indigenous Ifugao, right, producing rice, right, in order to sell to the Chinese. The Spanish artifacts that we see are interesting as well, because although the Spanish, right, attempted in this very quickly developing plurality of indigenous groups, right, they attempted to define castes, right? Once it became clear that you were not going to have just Spanish and just Indios, they defined different caste groups, right? So someone who was half indigenous, right, a quarter Spanish, a quarter African, etc., had a particular ethnic group name. And those ethnic groups, right, had ideals, both sartorial ideals, right, in terms of the clothing that they were ideally supposed to be wearing and that they were not allowed to wear, right, the clothing associated with a higher caste, as well as different food groups, et cetera. But you know, these ideals were in some cases very strictly adhered to in the Spanish Empire, but in the vast majority of cases, clothing, food, right, access to different things like hairbrushes, like medicine bottles, like porcelain, coinage, et cetera, allowed people to manipulate their identity within this complex caste system.
So when we talk about Spanish colonialism, clearly Catholicism and from the Spanish point of view, saving souls was one of three major goals that they had. And a number of the different chapters, not just these three, touch on elements of that. And I just at a high level want to talk about a few things related to these. Kevin Lane's chapter, chapter 6, is looking at the Spanish Catholic presence in the Highland Andes, and really juxtaposes, I think very nicely, Andean views of the landscape and religion versus Catholic. Kevin talks a lot in his chapter about this idea of a landscape of worship where not one particular place per se is important, but the landscape itself is part of placemaking. The mountains, the water, a wide variety of different sorts of things. And it's a sacred landscape in a sense. And so he talks a lot about how soon after the Spanish arrived in Peru, in a lot of these very rural communities, they appropriated elements of this Andean ideal and incorporated it into their Spanish churches. And so different things on the landscape that would be important to Andean culture in terms of this idea of a landscape of worship, the Catholic priests then incorporated into the churches to help ease Catholicism in. Maybe that's one way of putting it. And so, there was this appropriation, I think. And we see this a lot. We see this in the American Southwest with Catholic churches being built on top of kivas. We see it in a wide variety of different kinds of settings across the world. But, I think in all three cases here, as well as other chapters, there's also really a patchiness of effect in terms of the larger scale of Catholicism. In some places it took better than others. In Guam, which had been a very important place from the early 1500s with early expeditions and later the Manila galleons, there wasn't really much of a Jesuit presence for like 150 years after the Spanish showed up. And they actually, once they started this process of reducción, of forcing people out of their native settlements and into these towns and so forth with the church, they still allowed people to go into the countryside during the week to do farming and stuff. And so that gave them a certain sense of independence from the church. And Steve Tomka in chapter 10, talking about Texas, talks about a wide variety of things. But one of the things I thought was very interesting was this concept of hiding in plain sight in terms of Native American identity and Native American religious traditions and the continuity of them in the presence of Catholicism as well. And this concept of religious synchronicity, which is something Christine and I are getting going on, organizing a new session about for a couple of years from now. And so, there's a wide variety of topics in these three chapters related to different elements of Catholicism. And I think it really shows some of the breadth and depth that happens in different parts of the world related to Spanish colonialism over the course of 500 years. I mean, Kevin's case study is from a very early period in the 1520s, and Steve's is from the early 1800s and late 1700s. So we're talking about a wide variety of time periods as well as geography.
And then finally, much to our delight and surprise, one thing we discovered during our Amerind workshop was that the last chapter, chronologically, by Juliet Mersima, she's looking at the wildlands, right? The great frontier. This was an area of northern Colombia along the Dagua River that was so wild. It was never really claimed, right? It was certainly never colonized. there were some enterprises to extract mineral wealth, particularly gold, from this area, but they were very small, few and far between. On the other hand, it became an area where escaped slaves, right, went and established their own presence and created their own identity categories, their own society in this area, along with individual members of different Amazonian ethnic groups who had survived the slave raids and the epidemic diseases as well. So this top painting, right, is a map of the region. It's the cover of the book as well. Juliet uses ethnohistoric data to trace the creation of new identity categories by freed African slaves in this area. And in the course of her research, she found logs of names, right, in the archives of individuals who were part of the society created in this area, such as these porters, right? And the connection for us was that many of the last names of individuals from the archives, their last names are actually their place of origin, right? And guess where they came from? They came from the area, right, that Chris DeCourse works in chapter 1. And so we were absolutely delighted to see that even 400 years after the period that Chris DeCourse is talking about with the Portuguese colony and slave trading ports, right, in West Africa, that the descendants of many of the slaves that came out of places like Elmina, right, ended up creating their own society, right, in northern Colombia. And so this connection across space and time, right, was for us really emblematic of the book as a whole. Again, the themes of cultural pluralism, right, the pluralism that pre-existed Spanish colonialism, that grew and changed in very dynamic and different ways in all of these case studies of Spanish colonialism, and placemaking, right? Whether it was planting a cross on a beach in a Pacific island that the Spanish were never successfully able to colonize, whether it's creating a small little mission on an island in Guam and claiming that therefore the entire Marianas archipelago of islands belonged to them, or whether it was creating a real colony, right? Like a mission that in turn had at best a very tenuous hold, right? An important hold over indigenous peoples in the surrounding landscape, but that also, right, was part of a landscape that itself, right, was developing new meanings by and on behalf of the indigenous groups that were there. So thank you so much for the opportunity for us to present some of the central themes and lessons and connections that we learned about. We'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you both so much. And we do have some questions. The first question is if you could provide a few more examples of unsuccessful Spanish colonialism efforts.
Well, one example actually is San Salvador. The chapter in the book by Bill Fowler and Laura Matthew. Well, actually, when I think about it, well, yeah, in El Salvador, certainly, San Salvador itself, that town only lasted about 30 years. And it was just unsuccessful. And that's why for so long, it wasn't even quite known where it was. And Bill was able to find it, and he's been excavating there since the 80s. Chris, can you think of other examples?
Oh yes, many, many, many. I think an important one that was sort of in the heart, right, of the territory that Spain claimed is the Mapuche in Chile. And so even though Spain claimed, right? The area that is now Chile in South America, the Mapuche, the largest indigenous group there, were never successfully conquered, let alone enslaved and evangelized, right, or converted to Catholicism. To this day, it remains a real point of pride for the Mapuche. They were never successfully conquered by either the Inca or the Spanish. So that's certainly another example. Much of the Pacific was never conquered, right, or successfully colonized by the Spanish. But another really important example is China, right? They repeatedly attempted to make inroads into China, and neither they nor the Portuguese ever really had much success or much hope, right, of ever doing so, in part because most places where the Spanish went, right, they really relied on their indigenous allies, their political allies, and also because Spain, right, was back home in Europe, embroiled in a very long and complex history of European rivalries, of wars of conquest, of rebellions, of plagues, etc. And so much of the wealth that they extracted was simply folded back into the colonial enterprise, right? It was never economically from the big picture, right, a profitable enterprise, except for the Vatican, right? The Vatican did extract enormous wealth from the Spanish colonial enterprise of empire building.
Okay. Another question is, can you talk about the political and social situations in Spain and Europe that influenced the Spanish colonial goals and methodology, and how they decided where to colonize?
Chris,
God's looking at me. So, yeah, so there were long histories of rivalries back in Europe between France, England, the Dutch, right, the Spanish, within Italy, right. It was a long time before Italy was a unified country. The Vatican was always, right, a very, very big player, and the alliance between the Spanish crown and the Vatican was one that was incredibly important, right? So for a Catholic monarchy, for example, you needed the Pope's blessing, right, in order for your heir to be recognized, right, as the next king. And so there was a lot of negotiating between the monarchs and the Vatican as well, right? So the Vatican support was absolutely critical. I believe that's why from the very beginning, the Spanish, unlike the Dutch, the British, and to a lesser extent, the French, right, for whom saving souls was never as important as economic extraction of wealth and labor. For the Spanish, right, a third of the wealth that they extracted via labor or the extraction of resources went to the church, right? And the church, right, or the church's presence in the colonies also was supported, right, by the colonists financially as well. And so, you know, from the very beginning, right, for Spain, in large part, I think because of political motivations back on the Iberian Peninsula, right, to make sure that they were able to defeat their own rivals, et cetera, were funneling, right, a big portion of their resources to the church. And so for me, when I got to visit the Vatican about 12 years ago, and I was going through the Vatican Museum, for me, I was blown away because everywhere I saw the gold, the silver, the images, right, the raw materials, the labor, et cetera, of Spanish colonialism, right? That is what really built in every sense of the word, the wealth and power of the Catholic Church.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more. Please speak a bit more about the Spanish method of obtaining cooperation from indigenous people to help them take over territory and people of other indigenous people in Mexico and maybe other parts of the world.
Sure, I'll talk about that just a little bit. You know, this, to me, it's just so interesting how when Cortez showed up in Mexico, he had a very small number of, Spanish soldiers with him. And within several years, he's aligned, tens of thousands of Central Mexicans to go after other parts of Central America, like Guatemala, or getting on boats and going to Peru, or later the Philippines, or places like that. And I think, at least in Mexico, it had a lot to do with a lot of different groups were ripe for align with the Spanish because of the Aztecs and the way the Aztecs had treated them during their empire. And so I think it was maybe fairly easy is too strong of a word, but Cortez was able to work with these Nahua from Central Mexico because there were self-interests at stake as well. A lot of different expeditions, not just into Guatemala in the 1520s, the Coronado expedition in 1598, which went as far north as Kansas, had just a few hundred Spanish and up to 1,000 Central Mexicans. And in that case, there were promises made to those Spanish who allied with, or those Mexicans who allied with the Spanish, in terms of, gains, in terms of if you captured slaves, you could take them back with you. There were a wide variety of different sorts of things related to that. Chris, do you have other ideas?
No, I was just reading through the questions too. I really wish we had more time, and in particular thinking about but a couple of the questions are about like decolonizing our language and perspectives, and trust me, we do talk about that, but unfortunately I believe we're almost out of time.
If you wanted to address that, Chris, you're more than welcome to. I just didn't want to impose upon your time.
Well, we do talk about that a lot, both as scholars and as individuals. One thing that I think is important to realize is that we can't assume, right, that all of the contributors to the volume are white. In fact, that's not the case, right? There are Indigenous scholars among us, and we are all deeply committed to putting forth Indigenous perspectives, to supporting Indigenous interpretations, and everything from project methodology to final conclusions. And to also recognize that the scholarship, right, of Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous ways of thinking about these landscapes we're talking about, the ethnicities, et cetera, are far more complicated, right, than we're depicting them in this public talk. We are aware of the tensions there, and are committed, right, to continuing to educate ourselves and to engage with scholars from many different perspectives. So, thank you.
Excellent. If you want, we can go to a couple more questions if you have the time. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Alex has asked, could you speak to how the philosophy of colonization by the Spanish and Portuguese abroad was inherited from the legacy/experience of North African and Arabic colonization of the Iberian Peninsula?
Do you want me to take this one too, Jen? Okay. It's like this is more the kind of thing you read for fun. Yeah, absolutely. So, the Portuguese, unlike the Spanish, right, were very focused on economic extraction. They were not able to, until very, very late, right, until really the 19th century, in some cases, make much inroads in terms of colonizing the African continent. Their experiences, right, in trade, their experiences in socio-political relationships, their experiences in the importance of image, right? So putting limited resources into the construction of a fort or a church, for example, a big stone building, right? With a permanent, so they thought, presence on the landscape, were lessons that the Spanish very much absorbed, right? So think about early Spanish expeditions, right? Within the Pacific, within the Americas, within the Caribbean, et cetera, right? In addition to these rituals of possession, right? In places where labor and capital were in very short supply, the Spanish, and I speak here, right, in generalizations because the Spanish, right, included indigenous priests, for example. It included indigenous political leaders, right, who for a variety of reasons chose to cooperate. But the colonizers, right, whatever their ethnicity, also put their limited resources and capital into the construction of small churches, right? So in Guam, right, there was a road that was built, the Royal Road, right, in the northern part of the island to the governor's palace, right? And then there was the small mission church, right? And it was very small in scale in the southern part of the island, and that was it. Right, and so if these are the kinds of material signatures of Spanish colonialism in places like this, right? Churches, roads, processions, rituals of possession, right? Palaces, and a little bit of imported or reproduced European goods, right? You can see where the Spanish priorities, right, for leaving a colonial presence or building a colonial presence really started with the basics that were in turn borrowed from the Portuguese. Does that make sense?
I believe so. All right, so we'll make this one our last one. Why was the colonization of Texas chosen over the colonization of New Mexico, which was at least 100 years before Texas? And we have our indigenous, still well known. I apologize. The last section of that question is a little challenging here.
Sure. In the original SAA session, we actually did have a Southwestern person from Harvard. But as it turned out, he wasn't going to be able to participate in the Amerind session. And so we had to make some tough choices. You know, the American Southwest has a very, very long history related to Spanish colonialism, dating back to the mid-1500s. And I've actually edited a book with Billy Graves looking specifically at the colonial experience in the American Southwest. What we really tried to do, I think, is try to have a broad spectrum of case studies within the group of folks that were able to participate. So I think, you know, it would have totally made sense to have a chapter from the American Southwest. It just wasn't in the cards in terms of availability of folks. Chris, do you have anything else you want to add on that, or?
No, I wish we could have published a 3-volume edited volume, right? I mean, the original session was 16 papers, and even then we had a whole bunch of scholars who, you know, expressed interest in participating in that session, but who were already committed to another symposium at the same conference, for example. So yeah, this certainly could have been a 3-book project, but.
Yeah, and you know, one of the great things about the Amerind, and I think both of us, both Christine and I, are just so thankful that we were able to participate in an Amerind seminar. It's such a great experience. It's so intimate, and because it is intimate that way, you really have to limit the number of scholars. Amerind really likes to have around 12 scholars on campus. It partially has to do with just the amount of time that you have and ensuring that every paper has enough time. And it's also a physical aspect of it too. They only have a certain amount of space. And so it totally makes sense. You know, we could have had someone from the Southwest or a wide variety of other parts of the world that weren't included. And, you know, honestly, one of the things that I think both Christine and I like about this book is that it does have some unusual parts of the world included.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. We really appreciate the time that you've shared with us today. There were questions regarding where to find your book, The Global Spanish Empire, and that is available through the University of Arizona Press. And I noticed that's available in both the standard book format as well as an ebook for those of you who want to hurry up and visit the website to order your copy. We will also have a follow-up email within the next couple of days sent to all of our registrants with a link to the recording of this talk, as well as provide a link to where you can purchase the book. Again, thanks to both John and Christine for sharing their time and knowledge with our audience today. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.